Can we help you, old-timer? Did you get lost on your way to the bingo hall? The voice, sharp and laced with condescending amusement, cut through the dry afternoon heat. It belonged to a young Marine corporal, lean and confident, with a jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite. He stood with his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips as he looked down at the old man sitting quietly on a bench near the firing line of Range 7. Philip Lawson, 83 years old, did not react. His hands, knotted with age but steady, rested on his knees. His gaze was fixed on the distant targets, shimmering like ghosts in the heat rising from the packed earth. He had heard voices like that before, in places far more dangerous than a training range on a peaceful Tuesday. They were the voices of youth and certainty, the sound of a world that believed it had no more lessons to learn. Another Marine, younger still, laughed. "I think Grandpa's lost. Sir, the veterans' home is on the other side of the base." Philip slowly turned his head, his pale blue eyes clear and perceptive. Meeting the corporal's, he offered a slight, patient smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm in the right place, son. I was told to meet a General Davies here. I was hoping I might get to fire a few rounds while I wait." He gestured vaguely toward the rifle rack. "It's been a while." The request hung in the air, so absurd to the young Marines that it was met with a moment of stunned silence before the corporal barked out a laugh. "You want a rifle? Sir, with all due respect, these are M4 carbines, not museum pieces. You probably couldn't even lift one, let alone fire it." The small group of Marines waiting for their turn on the line snickered. They were a portrait of modern military might, chiseled, disciplined, and radiating an unshakable confidence. To them, Philip Lawson was an anachronism, a relic in a faded civilian jacket and worn trousers, a stooped figure who seemed to have wandered out of a history book and into their world of advanced optics and tactical drills. "I think I could manage," Philip said, his voice quiet but firm, a low rumble beneath their sharp, youthful tones. The corporal's amusement began to curdle into irritation. The old man wasn't playing his part. He wasn't supposed to be calm. He was supposed to be flustered, confused, apologetic. This quiet dignity was a challenge to the natural order of the range, a place where rank and physical prowess were the only currencies that mattered. "Look, old-timer," the corporal said, stepping closer, his shadow falling over Philip. "I don't know who you think you are, or what reunion tour you think you're on, but this is an active live-fire range. You're a civilian, and you're a liability. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "I have a visitor's pass," Philip said, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. It was all arranged. Just then, a gunnery sergeant strode over, his face a mask of stern authority. He was the range safety officer, a man whose word was law on this patch of dirt. His eyes, accustomed to spotting the slightest infraction, narrowed on Philip. "What's the problem here, Corporal?" the gunny asked, his voice a gravelly roar that commanded immediate attention. "This gentleman is confused, Gunny," the corporal reported, snapping to a parade rest. "He's claiming he's supposed to be here and wants to handle a weapon. I told him he needs to leave the premises." The gunnery sergeant sized Philip up in a single dismissive glance. He saw the stooped shoulders, the wrinkled face, the slight tremor in the hand that held out a laminated visitor's pass. He didn't bother to take it. "Corporal's right," the gunny said, his tone final. "This area is off limits. We're conducting qualification drills. It's dangerous. Now, I'm not going to ask you again. It's time for you to go." Philip's hand, still holding the pass, retreated. His gaze drifted past the gunnery sergeant, past the smirking Marines, to a flagpole in the distance where the stars and stripes fluttered against the stark blue sky. He had seen that flag in jungles so thick the sun never touched the ground. He had seen it draped over the coffins of friends. He had fought for what it represented, for the very right of these young men to stand here and dismiss him. "I assure you, Sergeant," Philip said, his voice still even, "I am not confused, and I am no stranger to a live-fire environment." The gunny's patience, already worn thin by the heat and the repetitive nature of his duties, finally snapped. He was used to instant obedience. This quiet, persistent old man was a disruption, a piece that didn't fit. "You're not hearing me, are you?" the gunny growled, stepping so close he was almost touching Philip. He jabbed a thick finger at the old man's chest. "You are a civilian. You have no authority here. Your memories of the good old days don't grant you a pass to interfere with the training of United States Marines. Now get out before I have you escorted." The circle of young Marines had tightened, their amusement turning into a kind of morbid curiosity. They were watching a confrontation, a test of wills, and they were certain they knew how it would end. The old man would be shamed, forced to shuffle away in defeat, and it would become a funny story to tell in the barracks later that night. A story about the crazy old vet who thought he could still hang. The gunnery sergeant's eyes fell upon a small, unassuming patch sewn onto Philip's worn jacket. It was faded, the threads frayed at the edges. The design was simple, almost crude, a stylized ghost superimposed over a map of a river delta. It meant nothing to him. It looked like something picked up at a surplus store or a VFW convention. What's this supposed to be? The gunny sneered, reaching out and flicking the patch with his finger. Your senior citizen's sharpshooter club. The touch, though light, was a spark on dry tinder. For a fraction of a second, the world of the hot, dusty range dissolved for Philip. The smell of cordite and sweat was replaced by the scent of mud and decay, the thick, humid air of a jungle night. The sharp crack of rifles faded, replaced by the muffled, terrifying thump of an incoming mortar round. He saw a young man's hand, his own, stitching that same patch onto the jacket of his best friend, hunkered down in a waterlogged foxhole under a torrential monsoon rain. They were kids, barely 20, about to step into a darkness from which only one of them would return. The patch wasn't a decoration. It was a covenant, a symbol of a promise made in a place that God had forgotten. He blinked, and the memory receded, leaving a profound ache in its wake. He looked at the gunny's dismissive face, and for the first time a flicker of something hard and cold entered his eyes. The confrontation had reached its peak. The gunnery sergeant, convinced he was dealing with a stubborn and possibly delusional old man, decided to end it. All right, that's it, you're coming with me. We'll get base security down here and sort this out. He reached for Philip's arm, his grip firm. The humiliation was now public and physical. Philip didn't resist, but a deep sigh escaped his lips, a sound of profound disappointment. But not everyone was enjoying the show. Standing at the edge of the small crowd was a young lance corporal, fresh out of boot camp. He had been watching the entire exchange with a growing sense of unease. There was something in the old man's bearing, a stillness and a depth that felt out of place with the insults being hurled at him. It felt wrong. A little further away, near the administrative building, a civilian logistics manager named Henderson was walking to his car. He had seen the commotion and paused, curious. He was a history buff, a man who spent his weekends volunteering at the base museum. He saw the gunnery sergeant grabbing the old man. He saw the circle of young Marines. And then his eyes caught the visitor's pass still clutched in the old man's hand. Even from a distance he could make out the name typed in bold letters, Lawson Philip. Henderson's blood ran cold. The name resonated with him, plucked from the pages of dusty, declassified mission reports he had read, stories that were the stuff of Marine Corps legend. He looked closer, squinting, and saw the faded, unfamiliar patch on the old man's jacket. He had seen a drawing of it once, in a file so restricted he was only allowed to view it for a few minutes. His hand shot to his pocket, pulling out his phone. He turned his back to the scene, his fingers flying across the screen. He found the number he was looking for, the direct line to the office of the base commander, Brigadier General Davies. The line was picked up on the second ring. "Sir, this is Henderson in logistics," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I'm sorry to bother you, but you need to get down to range 7, right now." There was a pause on the other end. "What is it, Henderson?" "It's your 9 o'clock appointment, sir. It's Philip Lawson." Henderson took a deep breath. "And they're about to arrest him." Inside the stately headquarters building, Brigadier General Michael Davies was on the phone, a frown creasing his brow. "What is it, Henderson?" "I'm in the middle of a briefing." He listened, his posture slowly changing. The casual lean against his desk straightened into a ramrod straight stance. His knuckles whitened around the receiver. "Say that name again," the general commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He listened again, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Lawson, Philip Lawson, dear God. And he's at range 7, now." He glanced at his aide, who immediately stood at attention. "I'm on my way. Henderson, do whatever you have to do to stall them. Do not let him leave that range. And for the love of God, tell that gunnery sergeant to take his hands off him." He slammed the phone down. "Captain," he barked at his aide, "get my vehicle, now, full escort. I want to be at range 7 in 3 minutes." The captain, startled by the sheer urgency in the general's voice, scrambled to comply. "And Captain," Davies added, his voice grim, "get on the horn with the archives. I want the service record for Lawson Philip. First Force reconnaissance, cross-reference with Project Chimera. Tell them it's a Trident priority. I want it on my tablet before we arrive." The mention of Project Chimera made the captain's blood freeze. It was a ghost, a legend whispered about in the highest echelons of command. A clandestine unit from the Vietnam era whose operations were so sensitive, so deeply classified, that most of their records were still sealed, 50 years later. Back at the range, the gunnery sergeant was oblivious to the storm about to break over his head. His authority had been questioned, and now he was going to reassert it. He tightened his grip on Philip's arm, preparing to march him toward the small administrative hut. "All right, that's enough of this circus," he announced to the onlookers. "The show's over." He looked down at Philip, his expression a mixture of pity and contempt. "You brought this on yourself, old man. You come onto my range, you disrupt my training, you refuse a direct order. What did you think was going to happen? We can do this the easy way or the hard way. A nice quiet chat with the MPs, or we can make a scene. Your choice." Philip said nothing. He simply stood, his dignity an invisible shield that the sergeant's threats could not penetrate. This infuriated the sergeant even more. He was making a final, irrevocable overreach, pushing himself past the point of no return in front of a dozen witnesses. "Last chance, Grandpa," he snarled. "Start walking." It was then that the sound reached them. It wasn't the familiar pop-pop-pop of rifle fire. It was a rising whine, the sound of engines moving at high speed, accompanied by the piercing wail of military escort sirens. Every head turned. Over the rise at the end of the service road, a convoy appeared. 2 black SUVs led the way, followed by a command Humvee, its lights flashing. They weren't driving, they were flying, kicking up a massive plume of dust and gravel. The convoy screeched to a halt just yards from the firing line, doors flying open before the vehicles had even fully stopped. Marines began to disembark, but they weren't in combat utilities. They were members of the general's staff, in their crisp service uniforms, moving with a disciplined urgency that electrified the air. The casual, mocking atmosphere on the range evaporated, replaced by a sudden tense silence. Every young Marine snapped to attention, their eyes wide with confusion and alarm. The rear door of the Humvee opened, and out stepped Brigadier General Davies. He was a tall, imposing man, his uniform immaculate, the single star on his collar glinting in the harsh sunlight. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made the gunnery sergeant's blood turn to ice. He instinctively let go of Philip's arm. General Davies didn't spare a glance for the gunnery sergeant or any of the other Marines. His eyes, laser-focused, found Philip Lawson standing alone. He strode forward, his polished boots crunching on the gravel with each purposeful step, the sound like hammer blows in the profound silence. He stopped 3 feet in front of Philip. His eyes fell to the faded patch on the old veteran's jacket. A flicker of profound recognition, of awe crossed the general's face. Then, in a move that sent a shockwave through the assembled Marines, the Brigadier General drew himself up to his full height, his back rigid, and executed the sharpest, most reverent salute of his career. It was a salute of such precision and respect that it was almost a physical blow. "Mr. Lawson," the general's voice boomed, clear and powerful, echoing across the silent range. "It is an honor, sir." He held the salute, his arm locked, his eyes fixed on Philip. The gunnery sergeant stood frozen, his mouth agape. The young Marines looked on, their minds struggling to process what they were seeing. A general, their base commander, was saluting this frail old man. Philip, his expression unchanged, slowly raised a hand and gave a slight acknowledging nod. The general lowered his arm. He then turned, his gaze sweeping over the petrified gunnery sergeant and the circle of young Marines. His face was pure fury. "You," he said, his voice dangerously low, pointing at the gunnery sergeant. "What is your name?" "Gunnery Sergeant Miller, sir," he stammered, his bravado gone, replaced by sheer terror. "Gunnery Sergeant Miller," the general repeated, the name dripping with scorn. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" Miller could only shake his head, speechless. "No," the general said, his voice rising. "Of course you don't. You stand here on ground that was paid for by the blood and sacrifice of men like him. You wear a uniform that he defined, you breathe air that he kept free, and you have the unmitigated gall to disrespect him." He took a step toward Miller, who flinched. "You see this patch?" the general demanded, pointing to the faded emblem on Philip's jacket, the one Miller had mocked just minutes before. "You thought it was a joke. Let me tell you what it is. This is the mark of the ghosts of the Mekong, Project Chimera." A gasp went through the few staff officers who knew the name. In the darkest days of the war in Vietnam, the general's voice rang out like a history lesson delivered from on high. There was a unit so clandestine it didn't officially exist, a 12-man team of volunteers from Force Reconnaissance. They were sent on missions that no one else could do or would do. They operated for weeks at a time behind enemy lines, with no support, no radio contact, and no chance of rescue if they were compromised. They were hunters, ghosts who tipped the balance of the war in entire regions. Of the 12 men who wore that patch, only 2 came home. "You are looking at one of them." He turned back to Philip, his voice softening with reverence. "This is Philip Lawson. recipient of the Navy Cross for his actions at Quezon, 3 silver stars, 5 Purple Hearts. The man credited with over 150 confirmed sniper kills, including 3 enemy generals. His records were sealed for 50 years to protect the operations he was a part of. He is not just a veteran, you fools. He is a living legend. The silence that followed was absolute. The young Marines stared at Philip, their faces a mixture of shock, shame, and dawning reverence. They were looking at a ghost, a hero whose story had been deliberately erased from the history books they had studied. The old, frail man they had laughed at was a giant. The general turned his wrath back to Gunnery Sergeant Miller. "You will report to my office at 0600 tomorrow. You and every Marine who stood here and participated in this disgraceful spectacle. You are all being assigned to a month-long remedial course on Marine Corps history, and you will personally write a 2,000-word essay on the history of force reconnaissance in Vietnam. But first you will stand here and you will apologize to this man." Miller, his face pale and slick with sweat, turned to Philip. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Mr. Lawson, sir, I am so sorry. I had no idea. My conduct was unacceptable. There is no excuse." The other Marines, one by one, mumbled their own ashamed apologies. Philip finally spoke, and his voice, though quiet, carried more weight than the general's roar. He looked not at the shamed gunnery sergeant but at the young Marines, their faces now full of humility. "It's all right, son," he said to Miller, his tone gentle, without a trace of anger. He then addressed the group. "The uniform doesn't make the man makes the uniform. You wear it with pride, but that pride should be rooted in humility, in the memory of those who wore it before you. Respect isn't about who's the loudest or the strongest. It's about recognizing the dignity in everyone, whether they're a general or a janitor. Remember that." As he spoke of the uniform and the men who wore it, a final sharp memory surfaced. He wasn't in a foxhole this time. He was on a dusty medevac helicopter, the air thick with the smell of blood and aviation fuel. His best friend, the one he'd sewn the patch for, was lying on a stretcher, his breathing shallow. The man's eyes were already losing their light. With his last ounce of strength, he ripped the ghost patch from his own jacket and pressed it into Philip's hand. "Don't let them forget us, Phil," he had whispered. "Don't let them ever forget." And Philip had promised he wouldn't. General Davies cleared his throat, his own eyes misty. "Mr. Lawson," he said, his voice full of warmth, "I believe you came here to fire a few rounds. The range is yours. Which rifle would you like?" Philip offered a small, genuine smile. He walked to the rifle rack, past the specialized long-range sniper systems, and picked up a standard-issue M4 carbine, the same model the young Marines had been using. He walked to the firing line, the weapon feeling light and familiar in his hands, an extension of his body. He didn't bother with the bench or the sandbags. He simply stood, raised the rifle to his shoulder in one fluid motion, and fired. 10 rounds, in a slow, steady rhythm. The young Marines watched, mesmerized. Through the spotting scope they could see the result. 10 rounds, all within the center ring of the target 500 yards away, grouped so tightly they could be covered with the palm of a hand. It wasn't flashy. It was economical, precise and perfect. It was mastery. In the weeks that followed, a formal letter of apology from the base was printed in the local paper. Gunnery Sergeant Miller and his men attended their history course, where they listened to lectures from decorated veterans who told them stories that made their own training seem like child's play. The incident became a quiet, powerful lesson that rippled through the entire base. One afternoon, a few weeks later, Miller was at the base commissary. He saw Philip Lawson sitting alone at a small table, slowly drinking a cup of coffee. His heart pounded in his chest. He took a deep breath and walked over. "Mr. Lawson, sir?" Philip looked up, his blue eyes recognizing him immediately. He gestured to the empty chair. "Gunnery Sergeant, please, sit." Miller sat down, his hands trembling slightly. "Sir, I just wanted to apologize again, in person. What I did, what we did, it was a failure of everything a Marine is supposed to be." Philip took a sip of his coffee. "You were young," he said simply, "and you made a mistake. The important thing is what you do after the mistake. It seems to me you're learning." They sat in silence for a moment, the chattering of the commissary around them. "Sir," Miller said finally, his voice barely a whisper, "could you tell me about them? The ghosts?" Philip looked out the window, a distant look in his eyes. A sad, gentle smile touched his lips. "I can," he said, "I can." And as the old hero began to speak, the young Marine leaned in, ready to listen, ready to learn, ready to remember. If this story of honor and respect moved you, please hit the like button, share it with a friend, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories of unassuming heroes. Thank you for watching.